The Gripe to Goal process is a process that enables us to deal with victims in an organization. Now, the first thing that's appropriate to examine here is why it is that organizations are so good at producing victims. And in order to understand that, we need to understand how accountability works in organizations. We've argued before that in any situation that you're in, there's always two variables at issue. There's what you get from the world and then what you give to the world. And what's important about that difference is that any result always sits in the get side of this problem. And your personal contribution, in other words, what you personally do, sits on the give side of the problem. And the key distinction between these two is that the difference between getting and results is that you have no control over that, because that's always in the control of the other. The only thing that you really have control over is what personally sits in your own hands. Which means to say that when you focus people's attention on results, you actually cultivate victims, because you focus people's attention on things they don't have control over. So we conclude, therefore, that organizations very often cultivate people who feel that they don't have control over their lives. And under these circumstances, people feel like and behave like victims. And victims gripe and don't accept accountability for the situation that they're in. Victims of gripes, masters of goals. It is your job to make masters. It is your job to help the victim turn his gripe into a goal. Turning a gripe into a goal, in one sense, is a very simple matter. If my gripe is that I don't earn enough money, my goal would be to earn more money. However, when you shift somebody's attention from dealing with the situation, from looking at it as a gripe to looking at it as a goal, there's a fundamental thing that happens, because in a sense, you're asking the person's attention to shift from the past to the future. Because clearly when you have a gripe, you're looking at what's being done to you. And when you have a goal, you're looking at what you personally want to achieve. So when you shift somebody's way of dealing with something from having a gripe about it to having a goal about it, in a sense you're not doing much at all, because you're just changing the way in which the person's looking at the thing. You're shifting their attention from what's been done to them to what they personally should do. The difference between a gripe and a goal purely sits in the phrasing. If my gripe is that I don't earn enough money, then my goal would be to earn more money. If my gripe is that I'm losing my marriage, my goal would be to save the marriage. If my gripe is that I'm in conflict with my boss, my goal would be no longer to be in conflict with my boss. The difference between a gripe and the goal literally sits in the phrasing. It might be argued that when you help somebody shift their way of dealing with something from looking at it as a gripe to looking at it as a goal, you're not really doing much at all. But that isn't true. Because clearly when I have a gripe, I'm looking at what's being done to me or what I'm getting. Whereas when I have a goal, I'm looking at what I personally should do or what I'm giving. When I have a gripe, I'm the victim of the other. When I have a goal, I'm the master of my destiny. When I have a gripe, I blame the world. When I have a goal, I feel accountable. When I have a gripe, I stagnate. And when I have a goal, I grow. And the reason for this is that if I want something from the other's ability to withhold what I want gives them power over me, and I get stuck, I stagnate. Whereas when I shift my attention from what I want to get from the other and what the other's not doing for me to what I should be doing myself, I rise above the situation in front of me and I grow. Now, practically, when you try and help somebody to shift how they're dealing with something from having a gripe to having a goal, that conversation would go through 4 phases. The first phase of the process we refer to as listening. And the point of the listening part of the conversation is to identify the root cause. That's the aim. Now, the key rule here is that you have to be patient. Don't assume that the first thing the person has said when they speak to you about their issue, that actually is the problem. A metaphor for this is to say that a person might have a stone in their shoe, but they really don't know what the stone looks like. You have to be patient enough to unstrip the layers to find out what's actually going on. So the first step of the listening part of the conversation is really to seek to understand and not to be understood. To be able to suspend your own agenda for long enough to really hear the person out. Sometimes this on its own is not good enough, because one has to actually get the person to start talking. And a good way of doing that is to rephrase back to the person what they're saying to you. And typical phrases would be things like, so you're saying that, or so you feel that, or so you think that. Now, when you say something like that to somebody, you're really just reflecting back to them what they're telling you. The effect on them is twofold. First of all, they feel understood. And second of all, they get given an opportunity to actually see what they're saying. That allows them to clarify, which means you can get a more accurate phrasing of the gripe. In other words, the product of this listening part of the conversation is a clear and as simple as possibly phrased gripe statement. Your gripe is this. It takes a while to get through this listening part of the conversation. However, the next part of the conversation, phrasing the goal, is very quick. It's almost like a punctuation point. Because the aim of this phase of the conversation is literally to take the content that's phrased as a gripe and to phrase it as a goal. So the aim here is to focus the person's attention forward. And the rule here is no new content. So for instance, if the person's gripe is that they don't have enough money, their goal would be to earn more money. If their gripe is that they're in conflict with their boss, their goal would be no longer to be in conflict with their boss. If their gripe would be that they're losing their marriage, their goal would be to save the marriage. So the product of the second phase of the conversation, the phrasing of the goal, is a clear goal statement which has got exactly the same content as the gripe statement, but it's just phrased as a goal rather than a gripe. The next part of the process we refer to as the brainstorm. The aim of the brainstorming part of the conversation is to establish an action plan whereby the person can achieve their goal. And the rule is to have an open mind. In other words, to put as many ideas into the pot that could possibly help the person to achieve the goal that they're after. And both the facilitator and the griper can put ideas into the pot to help achieve this goal. But clearly, the more ideas that come from the griper, the better. This brainstorming part of the conversation then goes through three parts. The first step is to cook a generous stew, to put as many ideas into the pot as you can in order to achieve this goal. The second step in this process is to edit the useless or dangerous ideas, because at some point you'll get a sense that you can't add any more. These are all the possible ideas that the person can conceivably undertake to achieve the goal, and then you reduce the set of ideas to the usable ones. Those usable ones you then sequence into an action plan, and that action plan is the product of this brainstorming part of the conversation. So again, the brainstorming part of the conversation takes a while. It's lots of content, and it's punctuated by the next part of the conversation, which is the commitment. The aim of the commitment part of the conversation is to establish clear accountability. And one does that by getting a clear decision from the person as to whether they will or will not pursue the action plan that was defined in the brainstorm. The issue isn't here that the person should necessarily buy the action plan, because you're not trying to solve the person's problem, you're trying to establish accountability. So let's assume that somebody comes to you and they want to speak about issues that they have in their marriage. And after listening to them for a while, you identify that the key thing that bothered them is that they actually were losing their marriage. So that would have been the clear gripe statement: I'm losing my marriage. Turning that gripe statement into a goal statement, the goal would therefore be to save the marriage. Let's assume that in the brainstorming part of the conversation, you establish that in order to save the marriage, the person would have to stop going to the pub, would have to spend more time with his wife, and he'd have to work a little bit less hard and stop playing golf. The next part of the conversation, the commitment, would then be to ask this person, is it worth your while to do these four things? Stop going to the pub, spending less time at work, spending less time on golf, and more time on your wife in order to save the marriage. If at this point the person says, no, it's not worth their while, this does not mean to say that the process has failed at all. The process has succeeded. Because what you're trying to do with this process is you're not trying to solve the person's problem. You're trying to establish a clear sense of accountability. The person has seen what they personally have to do in order to save the marriage. They decide that it's not worth their while to do it, so they are now accountable for the loss of the marriage. The loss of the marriage isn't something that's being done to them. It's something that they personally choose. The Gripe to Gold process is not concerned with solving somebody's problem. It's concerned with cultivating a sense of accountability.